Good morning. Well, I would also like to pray, so please join me. Lord God, we pray that you would be glorified in our time together this morning. May your word renew our minds. Help us to love you by loving that which you love, our neighbors, near and far. Lord, help us to trust you and to love them as you love them, as you have loved us. Help us to experience your presence, O God, and by it extend your grace and mercy and compassion to all we meet for your great glory. Amen. Our text this morning is Mark 12, starting in verse 29. It's the two greatest commandments according to Jesus, to love God and love our neighbors. Now, a Jewish scribe of the Torah, of the 5 books of Moses, of the Mosaic Law, asked Jesus, which is the most important commandment? And Jesus replied, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. This is the first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." Now, as Pastor Hal pointed out last week, the second greatest commandment, which is really an extension of the first, comes from Leviticus 19, verse 18. And in that context, the meaning that's most naturally read by the Jewish community would be your fellow Jews. Love your neighbor, love your fellow Jews. And in fact, the Jewish Publication Society, in their translation of the Old Testament, renders Leviticus 19, the words surrounding this verse, with terms like love your kinsmen, your kinfolk, your fellow. However, later in Leviticus 19, in verse 34, in the very same chapter, there are also other commandments to love the stranger as thyself. And clearly this stranger was neither Hebrew nor Jewish. And interestingly, God follows this commandment to love strangers with a reason that we can all understand. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Have you ever lived as a stranger in a foreign land? Had to learn another language? Then you know how living in a foreign land as a stranger can affect your treatment of strangers. Oftentimes, most of us tend to gravitate to and socialize with those we know, those who speak our language. But those who've lived abroad often are more sensitive to the needs of foreigners and will reach out to welcome the foreigner, the stranger, because they know what it's like. They've been there. It can be difficult when you emigrate to another land. It might take many months to make some friends who will tolerate your weak language ability, will welcome you into their home. It might even take years before you feel like a real part of society, feel included and not excluded. It can be lonely, meanwhile. And unfortunately, prejudice is rampant everywhere around the world. People will judge you by the color of your skin. They'll judge you by the foreign policy of your homeland. They'll judge you by your religious identity. As soon as they find out what your religious identity is, they may have some preconceived ideas of who you are. They don't know you, but they've already judged you because of these things. They might judge you also by stereotypes created by the media, a media who's more interested in selling copies of their newspaper or grabbing viewers' eyeballs. They're more interested in that than helping people gain a balanced worldview according to the mainstream reality of society. They're looking for sensationalism and extremism that will really grab your attention. They're not interested in giving you an accurate perception of the world. That's up to you to figure out. So depending on a complex mix of all these factors, the road for immigrants to gain acceptance can be very challenging, can be very difficult. It can take decades and may even take generations. Problem is, once immigrants are finally accepted as part of the mainstream, subsequent generations often forget what it was like when they were immigrants, their offspring, right? They forgot that they were immigrants some years ago, and that they were the foreigners, and they were seeking to gain acceptance as part of the mainstream. They might even get, those subsequent generations of immigrants, they might even get territorial and take ownership. This is our land. This is our land. And they might discriminate against foreigners, other foreigners. Why are you in my land? Is there anyone here who's a fully blooded Native American Indian? Anyone? Can I see some hands? So that means we're all immigrants. Well, isn't that interesting? Our ancestry, all of us, at one point or another, came from another land. Many of us, our ancestors, learned another language when we arrived. Chances are, many of us have also forgotten that. And perhaps we're the ones that are taking ownership and being territorial and saying, this is our land. What are you foreign strangers doing here? Have we invited immigrants who can hardly speak our language into our home? Have we welcomed the stranger? Do we bring them home-baked goods to welcome them to our neighborhood? It's easy to forget, isn't it? So God reminded the ancient Israelites, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. They knew what it was like when they were in Egypt. The Torah is full of commandments to be kind and loving to non-Jews, and therefore most devout Jews who know the Scriptures also know that God expects them to love the stranger as they love themselves. In fact, the Talmud has a story about a famous rabbi named Hillel who was asked by a Gentile, if you can teach me the whole Torah while standing on one foot, I'll convert to Judaism. Now, this Rabbi Hillel actually lived around the time of Jesus. He was born in the 1st century BC and probably died when Jesus was a teenager. So, in response to this pagan request to Rabbi Hillel, he said, okay, I'll teach you the Torah, the complete Torah, while standing on one foot. And so he did. He stood on one foot and he said, what is hateful to you, do not do unto others. That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and study it, he said. The rest is commentary. Go and study it. So clearly, many Jews were well aware that their kindness and love must extend beyond the boundaries of the Jewish community to strangers, to non-Jews. But loving the stranger as thyself? Wow, as thyself, the stranger. That is not at all easy, is it? I mean, if the divorce rate among church-going Christians is any indication, we often fail at loving our own spouses that we've pledged our entire lives to, for better or worse. Loving the stranger? Wow, the bar is quite high. So God commands us to love neighbors and strangers as we love ourselves. However, an already difficult task becomes even more challenging when we feel threatened by some strangers. Today, as you know, is the 10th anniversary of 9/11. 10 years ago, we can all remember where we were when we heard the news of the Twin Towers going down, planes crashing, shock, awe, fear, terror, tears, grief. It was a terrible day in American history, almost surreal for many of us. And as with other national catastrophes, it was a defining moment for Americans everywhere. It united neighbors and cities. We grieved together, we worked together, we even prayed together. President Bush called for a national day of prayer on September 14th, the Sunday following 9/11. And I remember knocking on doors in the neighborhood of neighbors I'm sad to say I hadn't already met, and invited them to another neighbor's garage for a prayer meeting consistent with our National Day of Prayer. And they actually came. Many came. We bowed our heads together. We cried out to God, humbled, searching, seeking answers. Who did this? Why? And as soon as media reports came out that Muslims were involved, that they were responsible, The grief of some turned into rage against all Muslims. Less than 24 hours after the National Day of Prayer, nearby here in Mesa, Arizona, Frank Roque went on a shooting spree looking for Muslims to kill. Ignorantly thinking that all people who wear turbans must be Muslim, his first victim was a Sikh from India, Mr. Balbir Singh Sodhi. Roque drove to his Chevron gas station. Roque then shot Sodhi 5 times from his truck while he was planting flowers around the garden of the gas station. Afterwards, Roque went to a local bar and reportedly boasted to his friends there, "They're investigating the murder of some towelhead down the street." Roque was sentenced to death for first-degree murder, but the Arizona Supreme Court later overturned his death sentence for life in prison. On the same day that Roque went on his killing spree, Mark Stroman in Dallas, Texas, shot and killed Worker Hassan, a Pakistani immigrant. A few days later, Stroman again went on the rampage, and he walked into a gas station and asked the attendant, the clerk, "Where are you from?" Before he could even answer, Roque shot him in the face with a shotgun. I'm sorry, not Roque, Stroman. Stroman shot him in the face with a shotgun. Miraculously, the victim, Rais Bhuiyan, a Muslim from Bangladesh, survived. Stroman was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. But guess who sued Governor Rick Perry of Texas in order to stop the execution of Mark Stroman? Watch and see.
I'm Amy Goodman as we turn to Texas, where a hate crime victim is attempting to save the life of a convicted murderer who shot him in the face as well, at close range after 9/11. Rais Bhuiyan is suing Governor Rick Perry in order to stop the execution of death row prisoner Mark Stroman. He's scheduled to die on Wednesday. Stroman shot Bhuiyan in 2001, partially blinding him in his right eye. Stroman, an Aryan Brotherhood member, also killed Vasudev Patel, an Indian immigrant who was Hindu, and Waqar Hassan, a Muslim born in Pakistan. Stroman's half-sister was killed in the attack on the Twin Towers, and he claimed her death fueled his rampage. The killings happened just a few days after September 11th. Bhuiyan is now calling on Perry to heed his demand for mercy and lower Stroman's punishment to life in prison, arguing the attack was rooted in ignorance. As a devout American Muslim, Bhuiyan told reporters his faith led him to advocate for mercy, not vengeance. In a typed letter from death row, Mark Stroman responded to a New York Times reporter's question about his final thoughts as he awaits execution. This is what he wrote. We have not edited the original response. Quote, "Not only do I have all my friends and supporters trying to save my life, but now I have the Islamic community joining in, spearheaded by one very remarkable man named Rais Bhuiyan, who is a survivor of my hate. His deep Islamic beliefs have gave him the strength to forgive the unforgivable. That is truly inspiring to me and should be an example for us all. The hate has to stop. We are all in this world together." Those are the words of Mark Stroman, scheduled to die on Wednesday.
A white supremacist on death row, hell-bent on killing Muslims, convicted of murder, is later helped not only by the Muslim community, but also by the very man he sought to kill, shot in the face with a shotgun, leaving him partially blind for the rest of his life. And why would the Muslim community want to save this man from death row? Because their Muslim faith led them to advocate for compassion and mercy, not vengeance. Rais Bhuiyan later explained that his parents in Bangladesh raised him to be a devout Muslim, and they taught him that God is merciful and God is compassionate. And they also taught him the Quran, the holy book of the Muslim community. Bhuiyan quoted a particular verse from the Quran that inspired him to save Stroman's life. He quoted Surat Al-Ma'idah 32, which reads, "And whoso saveth the life of one man, it shall be as if he saved the life of all mankind." Now wait a minute. Don't we keep hearing from fear-mongering leaders that Muslims want to kill all infidels and kill us? Why then would the Muslim community of Dallas try to save this infidel, whom many of us think is simply reaping what he's sown in this terrible crime? Asked another way, who's the real Muslim here? Was it bin Laden, or is it Rais Bhuiyan? Centuries of Islamic history and Muslim interpretation of the Quran suggest that bin Laden and his extremist disciples are the ones who drank the red Kool-Aid and should therefore not be mistaken as genuine Muslims, but rather deluded members of a fanatic religious cult. By God's grace, Mark Stroman now knows this. In Stroman's own words, he said, Bhuiyan's deep Islamic belief gave him the strength to forgive the unforgivable. Can we forgive the unforgivable? It's unfortunate that Stroman didn't actually learn this until after his killing spree. As Stroman later admitted, I was ignorant. I was ignorant. And yet, even amidst such ignorance, the Muslim community of Dallas graciously educated him with kindness and with forgiveness, overlooking his offense. Bhuiyan did not seek an eye for an eye. Sadly, we are barraged with so many media reports to the contrary that some Americans think that bin Laden's the real Muslim and Bhuiyan is the exception. Some sociologists suggest that an important indicator of a nation's development is measured by their treatment of minorities, religious minorities in particular. Well, what does the record show? How do Muslim nations treat their religious minorities? For many centuries, Yemeni Jews lived peacefully alongside the Muslim majority. They were neither exterminated nor forced to convert to Islam. Unfortunately, Jews have not always been treated so well in lands dominated by a Christian majority. For example, Jews in Muslim lands never suffered the horrors of systematic genocide as they suffered during the Nazi Holocaust in Christian majority countries of Europe. And while Hitler's religious views are debated, he clearly identified himself as a Christian. And he stated publicly that he regards Christianity as the foundation of German morality. Nazi belt buckles also read, God with us, embossed right above the swastika. Ask any Jew, who's the greater terrorist, bin Laden or Hitler? Well, let's see. We had 3,000 victims on 9/11, and Hitler had 6 million Jewish victims. 6 million. That's roughly equivalent to the entire population of Arizona. Without question, bin Laden could not recruit and mobilize as many Muslims to his militant cult as Hitler recruited church-going Christians to his Nazi cult. Why is that? Similarly, for many centuries, Christians in Egypt have lived alongside a Muslim majority, and never did Egyptian Christians suffer such wide-scale genocide or even the mass enslavement as Africans suffered after church-going Christian colonists arrived from Europe. As far as Muslims can see, it was greedy Christian entrepreneurs who began exporting human beings like cargo across the Atlantic Ocean to America between the 16th and 19th centuries. Thankfully, it was also Christians like William Wilberforce who fought to liberate slaves and abolish slavery. But it took a civil war in the U.S. to end slavery here in a predominantly Christian country, majority Christian country. Our Civil War led to over 600,000 deaths. Christians killing Christians. And people ask me, why do Muslims kill Muslims? Christians in the South of the U.S. even quoted the Bible to teach how slavery and segregation is God's design. Even after slavery became illegal in the U.S., do you think African Americans, many of whom were also church-going Christians, felt loved by their white church-going neighbors? Given that in many parts of the South, blacks couldn't even drink from the same water fountain as whites, or sit in the same seats as whites, or sit in the same waiting rooms as whites, I'd say the Civil War was just the beginning. It took a civil rights movement and the courageous dream of Martin Luther King to move forward. And the struggle still isn't over today. The KKK and other white supremacy groups are alive and well, as we heard on this news report about Mark Stroman. Some KKK members even occupy positions of church leadership today in the South. Thankfully, however, the KKK does not predominate in the U.S., no more than Islamic extremists predominate in the Muslim world. Don't get me wrong. There are plenty of cases where the Christians and Jewish minorities throughout Muslim-dominated lands have suffered discrimination, even as minorities in all lands suffer discrimination and prejudice, even in this great land. But if bin Laden was really representative of mainstream Islam, then all non-Muslim minorities would have been exterminated in Muslim lands long, long ago. So why don't we see anything in Muslim lands even remotely close to the injustice perpetrated by so-called Christian peoples of Europe, for example, in the genocide of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust by Nazis, or in the enslavement and sale of more than 12 million Africans by the Portuguese, by the British, by the French, by the Spanish, the Dutch, and Americans. In contrast to what many would have us believe, non-Muslim minorities have fared far better in Muslim lands under Muslim rulers than non-Christian minorities have fared under Christian rulers throughout history. And that's why Rais Bhuiyan truly is an example to us all. He was subjected to extreme prejudice and violence that nearly cost him his life. Did he seek an eye for an eye? He forgave. And after he forgave the unforgivable, he went and loved his enemy, seeking to save his life. And by doing so, Bhuiyan won both the respect and even the friendship of Mark Stroman. You'll be pleased to know that many Muslims share Rais Bhuiyan's desire to build bridges of peace and understanding with the Christian world. In fact, in October of 2007, 138 chief Muslim scholars, clerics, and intellectuals came together from all major Islamic schools of thought to declare the common ground between Islam and Christianity and extend a global handshake of friendship to Christian leaders everywhere. They addressed this letter to the Pope of the Catholic Church and the Archbishop of Canterbury and every other major Christian leader. And in this historic letter, they wrote, and I quote, "Muslims and Christians together make up well over half the world's population. Without peace and justice between these two religious communities, there can be no meaningful peace in the world today. The future of the world depends on peace between Muslims and Christians. And the basis for this peace and understanding already exists. It's part of the very foundational principles of both faiths, love of the one God and love of neighbor. These principles are found over and over again in the sacred text of Islam and Christianity. The unity of God, the necessity of love for God, and the necessity of love for neighbor is thus the common ground between Islam and Christianity." This common word letter to global Christian leaders goes on to show exactly how this common ground between our two faiths is revealed in the scriptures of Islam and Christianity by quoting various verses in the Quran and the Bible. Regarding love for God, the Quran says, "So invoke the name of thy Lord and devote thyself to him with a complete devotion." Regarding love for neighbor, the Prophet Muhammad is reported to have said, None of you has faith until you love for your neighbor what you love for yourself. The letter then points to our passage today, Mark 12, 29 through 31, as the biblical basis for peaceful coexistence between Muslims and Christians. The letter quotes, "And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, mind, strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself." The letter then closes with a colossal challenge. It says, "So let our differences not cause hatred and strife between us, but let us vie with each other only in righteousness and good works." Righteousness, the doing of good unto others. "Let us respect each other, be fair, just, and kind to one another, and live in sincere peace, harmony, and mutual goodwill." And you can read the rest of this letter online at www.acommonword.com. Now, in this historic letter, Muslim leaders have essentially acknowledged that there does remain significant differences between Muslims and Christians. Certainly, glossing over those differences are not going to help us build lasting bridges of peace between us. But in spite of those differences, our two faiths share the common ground of what Jesus identified as the two greatest commandments in all of Scripture: love of God and love of neighbor. Now, the Abrahamic Alliance was formed in 2008 to unite Jews, Christians, and Muslims in active peace building and in relief of extreme poverty. We build peace by uniting Jews, Christians, and Muslims to serve the poor, suffering, and marginalized. Recognize that gentleman on the right there? Uniting in a context of compassion helps each community rehumanize those often dehumanized by our myopic stereotypes that are often so common among people we don't know. We need to root our understanding of each other in real relationships, not in sensational news bites about religious cults or extremists. Our path to peace is to obey the commands of Jesus, to serve the poor, the suffering, and the marginalized together alongside Jews and Muslims. Sweat alongside virtuous Muslim men and women of peace for a few hours while serving the needy together, then enjoy a meal with them. And you'll see that not only can we peacefully coexist with the Muslim community, but we can also unite to serve the common good. Peaceful coexistence between Christians and Muslims is not some naive, distant dream. It's a present reality. Here, now, and in just a few hours today, members from this community will be uniting with members of the Muslim community to serve 160 meals to homeless families at a local shelter. And we're going to have a lot of fun doing it, too. A lot of fun. Thanks be to God, the Muslim community here in Phoenix is more than happy to unite with our seminar graduates to serve the poor, suffering, and marginalized here in Phoenix on 9/11. And like us, they're also looking forward to building lasting bridges of peace and understanding between our communities in the process. And those who attended the seminar here over the last 2 weekends are eager to do it now, too. Are you? In fact, far more attended the seminar than the shelter could accommodate. The shelter can't accommodate as many volunteers as we mobilized through the seminar and in the Muslim community. So, as Pastor Hal shared last week, Jesus is trying to expand our understanding of who our neighbors are. Thanks to Pastor Hal's commitment to working with the Muslim community, there'll be many similar service events in the future, Lord willing. So it's not just our next-door neighbors who we're called to love. It's not just fellow Christians and even fellow Christian denominations, even those denominations for whom we might not have the highest opinion. It's not just our fellow countrymen. It's the stranger. It's the foreigner. Now, Jesus made this abundantly clear when he answered the question of who our neighbor is when he told the story of the Good Samaritan. Like Muslims and Christians, there are significant differences between Jews and Samaritans. Samaritans claim their worship is the true religion of the ancient Israelites prior to the Babylonian exile. They claim that they preserved this true religion while Jews went off into exile and and it obtained a corrupted form of the religion. They claim, the Samaritans claim, that Judaism is a related but altered and amended religion. The Samaritan center of worship is also different. Their center is on Gerizim. The Jewish center is on Jerusalem. Their holy book is also different. Samaritans observe and regard as sacred just the 5 books of Moses. They reject all other books from the Bible Jesus read, the prophets, the Psalms, Proverbs, and so on. And their Pentateuch, their 5 books of Moses, is just slightly different than the Jewish Torah. Now, partly because of these differences, partly because of regional separation, partly because of other differences, Jews generally didn't associate with Samaritans. Now, certain ethnic groups commonly tell jokes about other ethnic groups, at the expense of other ethnic groups. And you can imagine that among Jewish jokesters, chances are Samaritans were the brunt of some of these jokes that were not so kind to Samaritans. One thing we can be sure, it'd be extremely uncommon for a Jewish rabbi to cast the Samaritan as a hero of any story. And yet, Jesus points to a virtuous Samaritan as the hero in his lesson to teach a Jewish audience who our neighbors are. And then Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." You can almost hear some Jewish replies from among those listening to him. "Excuse me, Jesus? Samaritans are heretics. They're unbelievers. Be like that Samaritan? They've rejected our prophets. They've rejected our holy books. Good Samaritan? Isn't that a contradiction in terms? Is it possible that there's a good Samaritan?" So we, Americans today, we don't have much problem with Samaritans. No. So if Jesus walked in here today and wanted to teach us about loving our neighbors on 9/11, I don't think he would be telling us stories about a virtuous Samaritan. No. I think he would tell us a story about a virtuous Muslim. A Muslim like Rais Bhuiyan, who forgave the unforgivable, then sought to save the life of his enemy. By doing so, Rais Bhuiyan turned an enemy into a friend. Now, if there's one thing I hope I've made clear so far, that is that most Muslims are certainly not our enemies. On the contrary, as many are going to experience firsthand today at this local shelter, Muslims are happy to serve the poor and suffering and marginalized alongside the Christian community. Muslims deeply respect Christians who actually take Jesus' teaching seriously and seek to orient their lives around obedience to Jesus' commands. Those commands to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to care for the orphan and the widow. And like the Good Samaritan, we have a great deal to learn from Muslims like Rais Bhuiyan. So go and do likewise. Love God and love your neighbor.